My name is James R. Walker. I'm Executive Director of the International Association for Communication in Sport.
Share how you came to be involved with the International Association for Communication in Sport.
Yeah, it was a sort of a backdoor thing. I heard about the very first summit, and I have, for many, many years, gone to a baseball-themed academic conference in Arizona and really enjoyed it around spring training time. And unfortunately, that year it conflicted with that, so I was not able to go to the very, very first one. And then it was the Cleveland conference that Alan Earnhardt and Youngstown State and some others sponsored. And a good friend of mine, Rob Bellamy, was asked to do a keynote speech there. And I had always wanted to go to one of the summits, and so I went down primarily to hear him and see him. We're good friends, and do some things in Cleveland, but really, really enjoyed it. And then I started coming pretty much every year since then.
What is your current level of involvement with the IACS?
Well, I took over the position of Executive Director. Mike Butterworth was our founding Executive Director and served there for 5 years and did just an outstanding job of getting the organization off the ground, organizing it, incorporating it as a nonprofit, and doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And it was time for him to move on to some other things professionally. So they were looking around for somebody with a little bit of experience in the field and also some administrative experience, and they asked me to be Executive Director. And I had just recently retired from my full-time teaching position, and this fit very nicely into my schedule, and then I could devote the time to it. So that's sort of how I got involved in being Executive Director. Executive Director is essentially a person who really is in kind of the background, and I think is there to help everyone else who has fairly clearly defined duties in the organization to facilitate them doing their duties. To work cooperatively with the program host, the host institutions and the people working there, the chair of the association, and then also to obviously pay attention to things like budgetary matters, tax matters, and things like that. Also, I think in the long run is to help grow the organization, to not grow it for just growth's sake, but to grow it both in terms of numbers and quality.
What do you see as the strengths and opportunities of this organization?
I think the strength it has is really two things. One, the subject matter is of deep interest to the scholars working in it, but it's also of great interest to their students. And so I think it's a very, very exciting time. It represents a new opportunity for lots of students to study sport communication at the undergraduate and graduate level, opportunities that did not exist in a really manifest form. So I think there's an excitement level there that comes from students through faculty, right? And it really creates the idea that you're creating something new and exciting, and that there's a lot of interest in, and that's very stimulating. I think communication scholars have found, and teachers have found, that by teaching sport communication, they could often deal with issues that would seem less accessible to students, but suddenly do become accessible. So issues related to ethnicity or race or gender, criticisms of that might be dismissed by some students as not particularly relevant to their lives, suddenly become a lot more relevant if it's in the context of sport, because they're interested in sport. And I've experienced that myself. Topics that would be a little bit harder sell for a teacher become a much easier sell, and the level of discussion and interest coming from the students, and that's the critical component of any educational process, are there because of the interest in sport. And so I think there's a lot of excitement in the field, related to that. I think other opportunities are simply the fact that the field is relatively new, so it's open in terms of the kinds of research that's done. It's accepting. And then the other real value of the conference or the summit is that it is a small enough venue that there's a very, very personal feeling and contact. You see the same people year in and year out. You develop relationships with them. And that does not happen at larger conferences. You tend to segment into much smaller groups. Here, there's a much greater sense of the whole, and also the excitement of developing something new, and knowing that there's a legacy that comes with that kind of work. That's not true of a mature field.
What do you see as the challenges the organization faces?
There's always challenges. You want to have good growth, but you want it to be controlled growth. You want to provide the appropriate service. You have to make some decisions as to what directions you want the research and scholarship to go. There's always a balance between the application of education and the role that we play in studying issues and sometimes controversial issues and presenting information that people don't necessarily want to hear, but in fact are very, very necessary for society. And that's really the role of a university. So growing into that, because there's a tremendous push for the applied. Students need jobs, the industry needs educated workers. And that's all well and good, but it's also important to realize that universities are about creating citizens, and that in one sense, almost everybody will find a job. It may be hard going at first, it may not be the ideal job, but most people will eventually jump that hurdle. The question is, what's your life like after that? And I think that's a question that university faculty have to take seriously in all disciplines, but it's especially true in sport communication.
What would you like to see the organization do as we move forward?
I would like us to continue what we're doing. I would like us to have a very strong organization. I'd like us to grow in a steady kind of way. In one sense, I don't want us to become too large, because I think you lose some of the real value of the organization if you do that. I'd like us to become the respected international organization, but we'll start with national organization in sport communication, and I think we're rapidly there on a local level. I didn't mention in one of the challenges, I think one of our great challenges is defining what we mean by being international, how we can be international. How can we promote that in our classrooms, but also in terms of our student experiences? Can we create situations where students and faculty have an opportunity to interact with students and faculty from around the world in very creative ways, so that the international just doesn't mean window dressing or it's just a title. It is an important part of the organization. And some of that goes on now. We get scholars every year from around the world who are willing to make the trip to the United States. A big issue before the organization at this stage is should we at some point start to think about having one of these outside the United States. And there's obvious issues with that. A lot of our membership, that would be a very long way to travel. We've been asking our European and New Zealand and Australian and other colleagues to travel great distances to come and be with us. But we certainly know that if we decided to do that, it would be a challenge for everyone to get there. And particularly for students and perhaps more junior faculty who maybe aren't quite at the same financial level as maybe some senior faculty. So there are some issues with that, but there are also some ways to begin to address that.